try to see here what the document prescribed as necessary steps to strengthen the strategic position of the United States and of the West against the Soviet Union. The authors of the document strongly cautioned American policymakers against what they viewed as the possible domino effect of Soviet expansionism, and also against the global challenge which Soviet belligerence, as it was presented, imposed on the United States and its allies. Because, quote, the defeat of free institutions anywhere is a defeat everywhere, unquote. The document pressed the US political establishment not only to stand up to the global challenge, but also to accept to play a leading role in the world. This fact imposes on us in our interest, the document counseled, the responsibility of world leadership. The document especially urged the United States to take a number of necessary steps so as to be able to implement the strategy to contain the Soviet Union at a global scale. The key recommended steps were as follows. Undertake a massive and rapid military build-up through substantial increase of expenditures for that purpose. This is in order to develop new weapons, both conventional and non-conventional. Be ready with the other NATO allies to use military capability, even in an offensive manner, when challenged by the Soviet Union, and substantially increase military assistance programs to allies and pro-Western countries across the world. Those included all countries fighting internal communist groups or confronted with external threats from what was called international communism. The document concluded with two fiery recommendations, or if you want, commendations, which would plunge the two antagonistic blocs into irretrievable enmity. Dialogue and negotiations are not the appropriate way to deal with the Soviet Union. Instead, the display of readiness to use military strength is the viable way to deal with the Kremlin. And the US and its allies should always endeavor to keep military superiority over the Soviet Union. And most importantly, should keep the option of using non-conventional weapons as first right wide open. And that was to mark an unprecedented escalation of American Cold War discourse. In this section of the lecture, we shall basically try to explore the fierce intellectual and political debate, as well as the forceful wrestling between the so-called hawks and doves in the State Department and Department of Defense over NSC 68. Quite simply, the hawks in the White House, the Pentagon, and Congress enthusiastically supported the analysis and recommendations of the document, calling upon the President to adopt it as official policy. The doves, on the other hand, disagreed with the conclusions of the document, considering them exaggerated and even misleading. Their major argument was that the report was drafted by the hawkish elements of the president's entourage, led by Paul Nitze. Amongst the staunch opponents of NSC 68, there was the influential diplomat and Soviet expert George Kennan. Kennan wasn't particularly convinced by its major recommendations, especially its call for a massive military build-up to contain the Soviet Union at a global scale. Instead, he and a number of other officials considered that the United States already had an uncontested military lead over the Soviets. He argued that, together with its allies, the United States was capable of globally containing communism through political and economic ways, rather than through military means exclusively. The Doves also disagreed with the conclusion that the Soviet Union was after world domination. Rather, they argued that it was only trying to strengthen its regional position, that is, its position in Europe, and that it had no intention to dominate the world. Those who opposed the conclusion of the document also put forward the argument that a global watchdog role involving massive military spending would overstretch and eventually exhaust US resources, something that could seriously weaken the country and even jeopardize its security. As the heated debate moved on, two major factors cropped up, and they would eventually help tilt the balance towards the stance of the supporters of the document. That is, towards the position of the hawks in the administration. Factor one was the mounting pressure being exerted in the White House by the anti-Soviet lobbies of Congress, accusing the President and his advisors of not doing enough to contain international communism. Such pressure was coming from the hawkish elements of Congress, led especially by Senator Eugene McCarthy. The senator even claimed that the State Department and other institutions of the government were actually run by communists or by communist sympathizers. Factor two was the invasion of South Korea by North Korean troops, supported by China and armed by the Soviets. This officially inaugurated the beginning of the Korean War. It was the outbreak of those hostilities that actually led Truman to adopt all the recommendations of NSC 68 as official policy, and consequently to make the document an integral part of the Truman Doctrine, which we discussed previously. With this, the Truman administration embarked on a program of massive military build-up, increasing military spending by threefold, and as a result, the defense budget of the United States was to skyrocket to reach 14.2% of the country's GDP, compared to only 5% up to then. We shall come back to these interventions, both direct and indirect, under the doctrine of global containment of international communism in our next lecture, hopefully. We shall specifically address the question of how the United States political establishment actually implemented the NSC 68 recommendations with regard to a number of wars, namely the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Algerian War of Independence. At a later stage of the syllabus, we shall touch on the other important question of whether the document actually continues, even today, to influence US foreign relations politically, militarily, economically, and culturally. And more specifically, we shall try to see whether the current foreign policy excesses of the Trump administration do actually have traces of that very NSC 68 document. For this week's assigned reading material, we have two items. With the lecture, they'll help you widen the scope of your knowledge about the topic, and also help you prepare for any required feedback in the future. We have a primary source text and a Journal of Cold War Studies article, which was published actually in 2013. Quite interesting article. You will find all the details about these two items on the online platform. So this is it for this week. Take care of yourselves, and I hope you stay safe.